The juiciest wild rabbit, brined, seasoned, and slow smoked to perfection. Loaded into some fresh jalapenos along with the cheesiest filling before being wrapped in bacon and smoked again to create what is undoubtedly the most delicious wild rabbit jalapeno poppers ever made. Who doesn't enjoy a jalapeno popper? It's the classic American barbecue appetizer. Fresh jalapeno stuffed with cream cheese and wrapped in bacon? Well, that's what we're making today, but it so happens that it's wild rabbit season right now. And I've decided to kick these jalapeno poppers up a serious notch by incorporating some incredible smoked rabbit meat into the equation. That's right, smoked rabbit. I'm talking about wet brining, dusting the entire thing with a dry rub, and doing some good old-fashioned direct heat barbecue. From there, everything comes together relatively quickly as we make our cream cheese filling and start assembling everything to become these jalapeno poppers. So what are we waiting for? I think it's about time that we hop to it. And here's the rabbit that we're gonna be using today. And there's not a whole lot left that I need to do to get old Bugs here ready to go on the grill. When I first field dressed this guy, I did a pretty good job trimming it up, cleaning it up, but we will go over one more time, make sure there's not anything weird kind of dangling off of it, anything that we need to clean up. You know, this sort of belly flap here, we don't really need that. There's not really any meat to that that's gonna do us any good today. So I generally like to just kind of snip that right off of there. Any little weird dangly bits of fat we can trim off. But this guy's looking mostly pretty good, just as he is. Pretty nice looking cottontail rabbit. We've got some nice thighs, pretty good looking meat on the arms there, and of course these little tenderloins on the inside. And I will go ahead and leave the skin on, even though by the end of this, we'll have deboned and peeled the skin off mostly and, you know, shredded that meat to use for the final presentation and everything, but it's not gonna hurt anything to leave that skin on while we do the main cooking step. So just about the last thing that I wanna do is really try to get this thing such that I can lay it pretty flat once it goes on the grill. And that's not really gonna be too much of a problem because again, when I do the cleaning and gutting and processing step, I do tend to snip it all the way up from top to bottom to really spread out that rib cage, and that's gonna let us lay this thing pretty flat. I might come in here and trim up a little bit more of this stuff up at the top, but that's not really gonna be a big deal either way. So there's not really much more to do with this guy except set him aside for a few minutes while we put together our brine. Okay, and for our brine, we're keeping it pretty simple. We'll start by going into this little half hotel pan with a half gallon of water, followed by 6 tablespoons of kosher salt, a 1/4 cup of white sugar, about 4 smashed cloves of garlic, and my, quote, secret ingredient, a 1/2 cup of dill pickle juice. We'll get that all mixed in until all the sugar and salt are pretty well dissolved. And then in goes Mr. Cottontail. And this is generally just the perfect amount of brine to fully submerge the rabbit. If it's not, add a little bit more water to make sure that it is. And now I'm just going to tightly cover this tray with some plastic wrap. Make sure it's nicely sealed in there. And then this whole pan is going into the refrigerator overnight so it can have a good long brine. I definitely recommend going at least about 8 hours, but feel free to brine for as much as 24 hours. I'll probably come back to this about midday tomorrow, so that will definitely give this guy a good 12 or 14 hours to soak in this brine. Now let's make us a seasoning rub. But because that rabbit was soaking all night in that salty brine, we're not going to be adding any salt to this dry rub. Just trying to get some good seasonings and spices on there without increasing the salinity any further. So we'll start with a tablespoon of black pepper, a tablespoon of some of my homemade smoked paprika, teaspoon granulated garlic, teaspoon of granulated onion, and a teaspoon of ancho chili powder. Get that all mixed up real nice. Make sure to spill a bunch on the cutting board, as always. And our dry rub is ready, and that should be just about the perfect amount for one single bunny. Okay, it's the next day, and our bunny rabbit has finished brining. It's smelling pretty good, and we're just about ready to get this guy on the pit. But after coming out of the brine, I did give it a quick rinse with some cold water just to wash any of that excess brine off of there so it's not overly salty. Gave it all a pat dry with some paper towels, and now we're ready to season with our dry rub. Once again, there's no salt added to this rub because there's plenty of saltiness that's gonna be in this rabbit meat from that brine. So we're just gonna go on pretty generous with this rub, making sure to get it all over every side and surface, in all the little nooks and crannies and under the arms, and well, you know the drill. Just a nice coating all over. And it's perfectly okay to go on pretty heavy because in addition to not having any salt, we are going to be removing a lot of the skin from this rabbit just in the process of deboning and shredding that meat. So basically whatever penetrates through and gets to that meat under the skin is where our flavor from the seasoning is coming from. So we'll just go on with about as much as will stick to this rabbit. That's looking pretty good to me, so I'll just let him sit here on this cutting board for a few minutes while we go outside and get the pit fired up. And what I'm doing here today is basically using the charcoal grill side of my offset smoker as if it was a direct heat smoker. And it's not the ideal setup to do that, but I've done it before plenty of times and it works pretty good. Basically what I'm gonna do is get some good lump hardwood charcoal lit up, and I'm dumping it into the charcoal grill side of this combo smoker, making sure that it's all pretty much just on the left side of that smoke chamber. And I'll throw a couple little chunks of oak in there just to give us some extra smokiness and some extra flavor. And when my temperature inside of this smoke chamber has come up to about 300 degrees, on goes the rabbit. I'll make sure to lay it out so it's pretty much as flat as possible, and I'll start doing the bottom side first. Now my aim here is to cook this mostly over those coals. That's the direct heat aspect of this cook. But if at any time it seems like the temperatures are getting too high and I'm putting too much heat on that rabbit all at once, I'll just go ahead and slide this grate over to the right and let it cook indirect for a little while until that temperature has come back down to about where I like it. And this will probably take somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 hours to cook this rabbit through. So in that time, I will likely have to add a little bit more charcoal, maybe a little bit more of that oak, just try to maintain that temperature in there at about 300 degrees. And after maybe about the first half hour or so, I'm gonna come in here and turn the rabbit maybe about every 20 minutes until it's cooked all the way through. And that's to an internal temperature of 165 degrees. Next, let's whip up a quick mop sauce. So into a little saucepan here, I've got about half stick of butter just starting to melt. And when that butter's melted, in goes 1 cup of apple cider vinegar, 1 cup of water, a half cup of pineapple juice, 1/8 of a cup of soy sauce, and 1 tablespoon of hot sauce. In this case, Frank's Red Hot. Now we'll get that all stirred together, let it come up to a gentle simmer, cook for just a little bit, then I'll just keep it over very low heat to make sure that it's good and warm when it comes time to apply to our rabbit. And around the time where I think that this rabbit is about halfway cooked, we're gonna start hitting it with that mop sauce. So each time I turn the rabbit from here on out, I'll brush the other side with a nice coating of that mop sauce, let it cook on there for a while, and 15 or 20 minutes later, I'll flip it again, brush it again, and just keep going like that until we're done cooking. This mop sauce is just going to impart some extra deliciousness as well as some extra moisture to this rabbit. All right, and while our rabbit is cooking away, we might as well get the jalapenos ready for these jalapeno poppers. And I don't know exactly how many I'm gonna need. That's all gonna depend on how much meat we get out of that bunny. But I'll go ahead and prep 8 of them just to be on the safe side. And I went out of my way to find about the biggest jalapenos that I could get my hands on. These are looking pretty nice. And all we really need to do is cut the stem ends off Cut them in half right down the middle, about as evenly as we can get. And then core out all of that membrane and seed business because we need that precious real estate to put in our filling. And it's pretty simple. I just like to dig in there with my thumb, sort of scoop that stuff right out, and go back in, kind of scrape away some of those extra seeds. And that's about it. That's our little popper vessel right there. So I'll go ahead and repeat with all of these other jalapenos. And there we have it, 16 beautiful jalapeno halves ready to be loaded up with our filling when it's ready. And there's really only a tiny bit more prep work we need to do, and that's to chop up some green onion. Okay, and after about 2 hours, our bunny rabbit has finished cooking and is probing at a consistent 165 degrees minimum. So now we're just gonna let it rest for just a little while, mainly to let it come down to temperature enough that I can actually handle it and start deboning. So we'll just wrap in a little bit of aluminum foil, let it sit here for, I don't know, 20, 25, 30 minutes. Then we can come back and move on to the next step. And while we're waiting for that meat to rest and cool down a little bit, let's get our cream cheese mixture together because, of course, any good jalapeno popper has to have a cream cheese element. So into a bowl, I'm going to add in 2 of these ordinary 8-ounce bricks of good cream cheese. And to that, I'm going to add a couple tablespoons of that chopped up green onion, give or take. Then about 3 tablespoons of some good barbecue rub. This stuff does have salt in it. This is just some of my standard homemade barbecue rub that I use for all sorts of things. And then just a couple dashes of hot sauce, maybe about 3. Now I'll get to mixing and mashing all that together with a fork until everything's completely incorporated and homogeneous. Well, that was almost room temperature, still a little cold, still a little firm. We'll set this aside while we get everything else together, and it should soften just a little bit more between now and then. All right, let's get into this bunny and start pulling this meat off of here. I figure I'll just start pulling meat off and see what happens. Not really too concerned with if some of the skin gets in there. You don't really need it, but it's gonna be fine if it's in there. That's where a lot of this flavor is anyway. Just like pulling the meat off of a chicken bone. I gotta tell you, the smell coming off of this is so good. I can't promise I'm not gonna have a couple little sample pieces while I'm doing this. And we'll get the other thigh. Just do it exactly how you'd expect to do it. Just pull the meat off, shred it up a little bit. And these front legs might have got a little bit overcooked because they're a bit smaller than the thighs, and I couldn't pull it off until them thighs were done. They're still gonna be delicious, and I'm not worried about it. And of course, we've got these little tenderloins here that are a little trickier to get off of there, but once you can get a handle on them, they peel right out. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about right there. And that's not a bad little pile of meat for a single cottontail rabbit. Now I'd like to break this down a little bit more so it's really nice and shreddy, and I can grab a little handful and pile it up on each one of those jalapeno poppers, so I might as well give it a pretty thorough chop while I'm in here. All right, got the chopped rabbit meat moved over into a bowl. Remember that mop sauce that we used earlier? I'm gonna add just a little bit of that into this mix just to help all this meat stay juicy and delicious. Also help it bind together a little bit while we pile it up onto those little jalapeno halves. That's looking and smelling really good to me. So I think we're just about ready to start assembling these poppers. All right, let's build some poppers. First thing we need to do is take some of that cream cheese mixture and just start loading it up into these jalapeno halves. I'll fill these up most of the way, but I do want to leave a little bit of room for the other stuff that we need to add to that. So I'll just repeat about 15 more times. Okay, those are looking pretty good, and I'll mention that with the 2 blocks of cream cheese batch that I made here, I could probably get about another, I don't know, 4 or 5 jalapenos worth out of that. Okay, next thing, you guessed it, some of that rabbit meat. And we're just gonna nestle a little pile of that right on top, pretty much as we can get to stay on top of that cream cheese without falling off. I think that looks like a pretty good little bit of morsels to me on that right there. So once again, rinse and repeat and do the rest. Well, by the end of that, I had to start rationing that rabbit meat a little bit between each one because I was starting to run low. But I got a little bit on every one, and that was basically the perfect amount for this quantity of jalapeno halves. Okay, 2 more things. First, I think we need just a little more cheesy goodness. So on top of each little pile of rabbit meat, I'll put a little rectangle of some nice Colby Jack cheese. And because these things are starting to get a little unwieldy and top heavy with that piece of cheese on top, I think I'm gonna help them along just a little bit, let them become one with the popper with my handy blowtorch. Doesn't need a lot, just enough to help that cheese start to soften up, take the shape of that rabbit meat a little bit more, and make this final step a little easier. Because you know no jalapeno popper would be complete without some bacon. And I've had this sitting out for just a little while because when bacon's super cold from being in the fridge, it can get a little stiff. And when it's just starting to come to room temperature a little bit, it's gonna be a bit more pliable. And the way I wanna wrap this is actually first long ways because I wanna seal in this open end of each popper so all that deliciousness doesn't spill out as it cooks. You know, that cream cheese is gonna wanna melt a little bit and start oozing out, so we're just gonna seal this thing up, wrap this completely around like that. I know most people like to wrap it the other way around, and I could add a second strip of bacon to each one of these, but we'll see how much bacon I have. Maybe I still will do that, but I'll go ahead and do them all long ways first. Well, I had exactly enough strips of bacon to wrap each one of these poppers one time, and I think that's gonna work out just fine. We got a little jalapeno peeking out the side on some of them. I think that's gonna be just fine. And these are feeling pretty good and secure, but you know, I don't wanna screw around and risk having any kind of a blowout, so I will go ahead and stick a couple of toothpicks in each one just to be extra safe, because if these started falling apart mid-cook before I could even devour them, that would be the real tragedy. And there we are, all of our beautiful assembled barbecue rabbit jalapeno poppers. And these things are ready to go back on the pit. Now what I'm going for is some beautifully cooked bacon, some wonderfully tender and softened jalapenos, and some good melty cheese. But what I absolutely don't want is for anything to burn. So I'll be doing this entire step with indirect heat. I'll get these poppers all laid out on my grate. All of my fire, all of the coals are on the other side, and I'm just gonna cook these away somewhere in the neighborhood of 350 degrees until that bacon's looking crispy, the jalapenos are perfectly tender. If it seems like any of these poppers are getting more heat than any others, I can rearrange them a little bit as I go. And as if I wasn't gonna take one more chance to make this entire cook a little more ridiculous, we're gonna make one last little glaze that'll get brushed onto that bacon when it's just about finished cooking. But it's super simple, and all we need is a half cup of brown sugar, a cup of water, and a teaspoon of balsamic vinegar. We'll get that all whisked together and just bring this up to a very low simmer. Let it thicken up a little bit, and just about the time that our bacon is ready for it, it'll be ready. Because how could a little kick of sweetness on the outside of that bacon not be a good thing? We're going through all this time and effort to make the most delicious jalapeno popper ever, so right before the finish line is no time to start slacking. And when they're all looking absolutely delicious, off they come. And finally, after what was probably way too many steps to make what's supposed to be a simple barbecue appetizer, our wild rabbit jalapeno poppers are finished. And now finally, I can take a bite and enjoy the fruits of all that labor. Oh my God, there is so much flavor going on in this thing. The first thing I taste is the smokiness from that rabbit meat and the seasonings and that cream cheese filling. The jalapeno kind of sneaks up afterwards, and of course the bacon just, well, literally ties the whole thing together. I've said it a million times, I'm a lightweight when it comes to spicy food, and a jalapeno is pretty much at the high end of what I can handle. But you essentially roast them for a while, you dilute it down with all these other flavors, and it's not so bad. Definitely still getting that zing, but it's certainly muted enough that I think that I can eat a clinically unhealthy amount of these, which I suspect I will. Absolutely delicious. I don't think I would change a single thing about it. I'm not sure if that brown sugar glaze at the end really contributed a whole lot, but I liked the idea, and I guess it was worth trying. Don't know if I'm really picking up on much of that sweetness. And do you have to make this with rabbit, wild or otherwise? No, of course not. But if you like the idea of that meat component, just do everything the exact same, but with chicken. And you don't even need to make an entire spatchcock chicken. You could, of course, just do some skin-on, bone-in chicken thighs. But even if you want to keep your jalapeno poppers a little more close to traditional without any meat in them other than the bacon, I'm telling you to try everything else about this recipe exactly the way I did it. Mixing the seasonings and that dash of hot sauce and the green onion into the cream cheese. And I stand by wrapping the bacon long ways around it to keep the cheese filling from spilling out of that open end. I don't know. And of course, when at all possible, do it in the smoker or at least on a grill, because of course it's gonna be better. But I suppose you could do this in an oven too if you wanted your jalapeno poppers to be sad. I'm sure they'd still be tasty though. Anyway, if you do want to try making some or every part of this jalapeno popper recipe for yourself, of course I'll have a link to the full written out recipe in the video description below that covers everything that I did here. In the meantime, please be sure to like and subscribe and stay up to date with all our latest stuff, including future wild game cooking, barbecue, smoking, food, and all manner of cooking videos. If you liked this video, or you've watched a few of my videos and you haven't subscribed, it truly does help me out. It helps YouTube tell more people about me, which lets me continue growing my little YouTube channel and making these videos week after week, year after year. Anyway, that's it for now. I hope you liked my rabbit jalapeno poppers. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'm John, and this is Great Lakes Country.